Okay, now.
We promised to show that North-South relations were the driving force of global economic history from the Reagan Revolution to the present. There was a bit of hyperbole in this promise. The fact is that the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War cannot be reduced to North-South economic issues. The communist economic system collapsed under its own weight for reasons that were internal to the communist economic system. Oh, and by the way, to back up a little bit, this is about my book, The Reagan Revolution in the Developing Countries, and it covers an aspect of the book which was not covered in the two Harold Channer interviews, namely the fall of communism. What we will show, however, is that the impact of this collapse on the West cannot be understood apart from an understanding of North-South relations. For the past 500 years, two seminal forces have shaped the evolution of the world capitalist system. 1. Scientific and technological advance in the West. 2. The colonization of the West by the West of what is today the Third World. The West and the Third World share with each other a 500-year historical relationship to which the Eastern Bloc was to some extent external. In other words, the West plus the Third World on the one hand, and the Eastern Bloc on the other hand, form two separate world systems whose trajectories over the past 1,000 years, though intersecting at some points, have had very different equations of motion. The widespread failure to appreciate this fact was to have enormous political and economic repercussions in the early 90s. To explain this in more detail, let's go back to the beginning of the book. In chapter 4, we describe the concept of rational expectations. Rational expectations is the way in which consumers, producers, and investors change their future economic behavior in response not to their perfect foreknowledge of future political changes, which is impossible, but to their rational expectation of future political changes, to the actuarial estimate of the future impact of governmental and political changes. An important concept in understanding the political and economic crisis of the early 70s is the concept of plausible but ahistorical expectations. Plausible but ahistorical expectations, precipitated by the fall of communism but shaped by North-South relations, lay behind the political and economic crises of the early 90s. The European monetary crisis, the Gulf War, the U.S.-Israeli conflict over settlements. The most important of these plausible but ahistorical expectations was a belief called by the Japanese white centrism, that the white areas of post-communist world, America, East and Western Europe and Russia, constitute an economic bloc with enough people to marginalize the Third World and possibly Japan as well. Let's give a brief overview of white centrist beliefs. According to left-wing right centrism, a la Gorbachev and the Western liberals, a massive Marshall Plan from west to east can generate an economic boom in Europe, lift the Russian standard of living toward European levels, and provide an engine of growth for the developed world. According to right-wing white centrism, a la Yeltsin and the Western neocons, a high level of education, technology, and Western culture will enable the newly liberated Eastern Bloc to replace the Third World as a source of cheap labor and raw materials. The fallacy of left-wing right centrism was demonstrated by the financial debacle of German reunification. The fallacy of right-wing white centrism was demonstrated by the political consequences of IMF shock therapy when applied to Russia. Be that as it may, white centrism played a very important role in shaping world events. Indeed, it played an important role in the collapse of communism itself. Observers in the Eastern Bloc at all levels of society had seen the success of third world countries in attracting Western capital and in capturing Western markets. It was a short step from this conviction that a non-communist Eastern Bloc, being educated, technologically skilled, culturally European, would be at least successful as the third world in both endeavors and would attract more direct Western aid as well. For example, in early 1990, a Polish Solidarity member expressed a sentiment that was widespread in the post-communist Eastern Bloc, but he said, quote, "A failure of democratic renewal in the heart of the old continent would be much more detrimental to the fundamental interests of the West than the perpetuation of gross social and political injustice in the Third World. Major economic interests will also be involved. Central European countries offer Third World advantages to investors, a cheap and eager labor force, liberal tax and profit policy, an insatiable internal market. This comes without the inherent Third World dangers of political destabilization, while the technological and social infrastructure of Central Europe is more developed. The Third World will probably lose not only some of this, but some of this private investment as well. Of course, there seems to be some sort of scandal attached to this. Central Europe's most serious basket case, is in better shape than, say, Bangladesh. Jivi Takhtashvili, chairman of the Georgian Parliament Committee on Economic Reform under the Gamsa Kurdia regime, put the case even more bluntly. We helped the West during the Crusades. When the Mongols were descending on Europe, we formed a barrier. The West will help. Gentlemen never forget to pay their debts. Russian disappointment over the failure of this aid and capital investment to materialize in the amounts that were expected was one of the reasons for the coup attempts of 1990 and the rebellion of the Hasbulat of Parliament in 1993. In both cases, the insurrectionists thought anti-Western hostilities caused by failed expectations would enable them to muster military and populist support. It is a truism to say that the fall of communism had a tremendous impact on American politics. This impact has been the subject of an enormous amount of discussion. What has been completely overlooked in this discussion, to our knowledge, is the impact of the fall of communism on American race relations. Of course, you might be thinking the fall of communism had an impact on everything, and therefore also had an impact on race relations. But that's not what we mean. To see what we mean, let's go back to our concept of white centrism. By white in this context, we mean not Caucasoid, but Anglo-European, as opposed to, say, East Indian, Arab, Persian, Turkish, Afghan, Berber, Hispanic, and so on. We mean politically white, from the point of view of American racial politics. Prior to the fall of communism, an American observer looking at the world capitalist system would see a system in which whites were dominant from an economic point of view, but in which non-whites were overwhelmingly dominant from a demographic point of view. From a demographic point of view, non-whites were an order of magnitude superior to whites, billions as opposed to hundreds of millions. Unless one believed in endless economic expansion on a fixed population, it didn't take much imagination to see that continued capitalist expansion would eventually require the participation of non-whites. It was this perception in the late 80s that gave American black politics an overtone of global social democracy, an overtone that showed up in Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition. One of the messages of the Jackson movement was that American blacks could act as an economic and political bridge between American and the non-white world. Indeed, in the 1980s, Jackson was the only American politician with a broad base of popular support in American domestic politics who also had a broad base of popular support in the Third World. He was certainly the only presidential candidate who could meet with Yasser Arafat without being hooted out of the race. In other words, the Rainbow Coalition and the Jackson movement gave American blacks what seemed to be at the time a potentially important role on the world stage. After the fall of communism, however, this perception changed. Now it seemed that 400 million whites had been suddenly and instantaneously thrown into the world capitalist system. The demographic balance did not seem overwhelmingly unfavorable for whites. It was possible to imagine a global white bloc sufficiently populous to permit self-sustaining economic growth without the need for non-whites. Many observers declared the Third World irrelevant. Africa in particular, with its famines, droughts, civil wars, and plagues, having lost its Cold War importance, seemed to be headed for total isolation. As the development economist Andre Gunder Frank put it, there was a decreasing market for Africa's natural and human resources. Having been squeezed dry like a lemon, much of Africa may now be abandoned to its fate. That such a perception would have enormous impact on global race relations goes without saying. How could it not? The global social democracy of Japan's Rainbow Coalition was replaced by a defensive black centrism, a militant black particularism which said you might be able to ignore them, but you won't be able to ignore us so easily. We're here, a sentiment which was summed up in the phrase, no justice, no peace. White centrism also had an enormous effect on politics within the Third World. We already mentioned how Salinas of Mexico, nervous about the possibility of competition from the Eastern Bloc, began to seek admittance into the U.S.-Canadian Free Trade Zone, and how Saddam, worried about another Ceausescu, worried about becoming another Ceausescu, invaded Kuwait. In addition, there was a pervasive feeling in the Third World that just at a time when the West was recovering from its euphoria over the fall of OPEC and sensing the limits of the Western market, was beginning to attach renewed importance to Third World development. The Third World was suddenly marginalized yet again, this time by a newly capitalist Eastern Bloc. In other words, to use a forced and rather flippant analogy, considering the seriousness of the issues involved, if we were to compare the world economy to a senior prom, we could say that the West was about to ask the Third World to dance and the Eastern Bloc cut in. Quote, both Latin America and Africa now feel they will be the losers as the West takes new interest in Eastern Europe. At the same time, the majority from the developing world sees its influence at the United Nations diminishing as real power passes to the United States and the Soviet Union. The result is a growing third world resentment. Paul Lewis, New York Times, 9/23/90. The Palestinians in particular, having made concession after concession to Israel and its American sponsor, felt that they were now about to be overwhelmed by a surge of Russian Jewish immigrants to the West Bank. There is no doubt in our mind that the resentments in the Third World over the West's sudden rapture at the newly capitalist Eastern Bloc was one of the reasons why Saddam thought he could get popular support for his invasion of Kuwait. According to a New York Times editorial of 2691, Saddam won the support of millions of people in the Third World. Quote, that they cheer such a loathsome tyrant sends Washington an important message, one that must be addressed if the war is to be followed by a durable peace. Pro-Iraqi sentiment is particularly strong in countries with pro-Western governments, including some that have sent troops to the Gulf. Most countries in the Third World were once exploited colonies of Europe. Ordinary people in these lands do not consider themselves beneficiaries of the present world order and doubt that the promise of a new one. And probably the only useful way is for Washington and its allies to show that the new order is not going to become a rich man's club. Perhaps this resentment was felt by Saddam personally, since many people, such as Mubarak, who observed Saddam's regrets and anxieties and second thoughts after his invasion of Iraq, after his invasion of Iran, were flabbergasted that he would provoke a war with the United States and its allies. To summarize, at the end of 1989 and the beginning of 1990, the collapse of communism in the Eastern Bloc swept aside environmental and political concerns and produced a burst of euphoria in America at the prospect of hundreds of millions of whites entering the world capitalist system. It was assumed that these people were white, European, skilled, and educated, and they would rapidly provide the West with economic stimulus as they privatized. Comparisons were made to Western Europe after World War II. There were calls for a new Marshall Plan, and predictions that the underdeveloped world were now irrelevant. The Japanese called the white centrism. The white centrist euphoria strengthened Bush and the Republicans, and thus tended to keep protectionist sentiment at bay. Anyway, another important point to make about the book is that it was written in 1993. It wasn't published in It couldn't find a publisher in 1993 because its prediction that the Third World would be increasingly important its prediction that the engine of growth would no longer be the developed West, but would be the underdeveloped South, was considered far-fetched. However, in 2011, this prediction came true in spades, and thus the book got published and attracted a huge audience. Okay.